Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Bridger of Worlds podcast. I am your host, Ioannis Kokkinos. Thank you so much for joining me. If you are on YouTube watching, thank you for tuning in. If you're listening on one of the hosting platforms, thank you for tuning in as well. So today is episode number 4, and I do want to bounce from episode 2 and 3 because those two episodes did have some commonalities between them. So in the second episode, I talked about the witness in relationship to the shadow. And in episode 3, I talked about the witness being the masculine polarity, the conscious masculine polarity, in relationship to providing space, holding space for life, the ever changing, ever fluctuating expression of life, which is the feminine polarity. So does that mean the shadow is the feminine? No, of course not. The shadow has an emotive process. The feminine is the emotive process within us. The feminine as a polarity is responsible for our internal world. The feminine as a symbol means inner or receptive or passive. The masculine as a symbol is about being active, penetrative. It's outer. So we talked a lot about the shadow, which is very much about our inner world, but the shadow can actually be broken down into shadow feminine and shadow masculine. What I talked about as far as the shadow is concerned in the previous episodes, that's very much the shadow feminine polarity because it solely has to do with the internal experience. So like the denied, the rejected, the hidden, the unseen, the unconscious, right? It's not in our conscious awareness. It's very much out of sight. It's hidden. It's the feminine. But that energy, that polarity also feeds the shadow masculine energy. And because the masculine, as I just said, is about the outer experience, this can also be very much directly linked to our ego, but more specifically, our unhealthy ego. Because the ego is the I, it's the me, it's what I want, what I need, what I desire, me, I, right? We've all been there. But because really there's no masculine without feminine and no feminine without masculine, if let's say that shadow feminine is pained, is hurting, there's an unconscious emotion there that needs release, needs witnessing, and that's not happening, it can eventually lead us to go out into our external reality to seek gratification, to seek pleasure, addictions develop, compulsions, so on and so forth, to make up for that feeling. And it's very much about 0 F's given about everyone and everything. Disregarding other people, disregarding other people's feelings, disregarding the relationships of our lives. So that is unhealthy masculine energy, shadow masculine, unhealthy ego. Now, the ego and the shadow do have their differences. The shadow is about what we don't know about. The shadow is the hidden. The shadow is the rejected. The shadow is the denied. The ego, we do know what's going on. We know what's going on to a certain extent because the ego is oblivious to all non-material and non-physical conditions, which is where we start to move into the world of spirituality, into the realm of spirit. So like meditation, right? When we're meditating and we're sitting with the quiet, we're sitting in the dark, we're really going in, we're inner seeking, right? The ego's like, what the fuck is going on? What's happening? The ego just constantly wants to know and understand what is going on. Because as I mentioned, the ego is very much about safety. It's very much about the need to feel safe in our physical reality. But that actually connects to our shadow feminine energy, because it's the feminine that needs to feel safe. It's the feminine that needs to feel safe when the container is offered so that she can express herself, so that emotions can move, so that feelings can be felt and eventually transform. This is why we offer the space. This is why we offer no judgment, because when the feminine feels judged, she will not feel. And if she does not feel, there's no transformation. So, yes, the ego is very much about our safety, but that very much connects to our feminine energy. So, when the feminine doesn't feel safe, when there's not a container available, where there's no safety available, all that stuff will fester within our bodies, within our psyches. And then the shadow masculine, or the unhealthy ego, will do whatever it can out in the external environment to make up for that feeling of non-safety. So a little real life example, my porn addiction. This was very, very much shadow feminine and shadow masculine, because that was in a time in my life where I was not feeling safe as I was entering adolescence, my first rite of passage, right? Adolescencehood, the end of boyhood. This is a rite of passage. For me, this was a very, very scary time. I will leave the story for another episode. But basically, all that fear and all that feeling of not feeling safe led me to the porn. So it was my shadow feminine, my inner world that didn't feel safe, that fed into my shadow masculine, seeking gratification, seeking pleasure through the porn watching. And then obviously the porn watching became porn addiction. Addiction is actually very much a shadow feminine word. But we can't ever have the feminine without the masculine. We can't ever have the masculine without the feminine. So when we are addicts or we have an addiction, we have a certain feeling within ourselves, and then we're doing something outside of ourselves to make up for that feeling. So shadow masculine, shadow feminine. Something else to know about the ego, it actually comes from two ancient Greek words, ego. E was I in ancient Greece, e. Rho is from yi, which means earth. So it's basically I of the physical material plane. So when I show up and it's only about me, it's only about me, nobody else, this is the shadow masculine. When the I shows up and others are included, others are regarded, the I goes beyond self-serving and goes into service for the greater whole. This is conscious masculine, healthy masculine energy. And when healthy masculine energy is present, and as I just mentioned, it's about going beyond oneself to serve the greater whole, meaning we're coming into connection, we're coming into relationship with others, the feminine is involved. The feminine is the we. The masculine is the I. So we can use conscious masculine energy to actually hold space for both the shadow feminine and the shadow masculine. What's conscious feminine energy? Conscious feminine energy are feelings that are vibrating high. So like the elevated emotions, the elevated feelings. Because again, the masculine is still holding space for these feelings, for these emotions. So if the conscious masculine is giving that space and giving that safety, which is basically what the feminine needs. The feminine needs to feel safe above all else in order to transform from the lower emotions to the higher emotions. And once those higher emotions are reached and the container is present, we have conscious feminine energy present. Because, as I mentioned in the previous episode, the feminine is life. So we have elevated life, we have low life, it's just fluctuating. It's the dance, it's the movements, it's the shifts, and it has to do with our emotions. The feminine needs to feel safe above all else. This is crucial step number one when doing polarity work, because there may be a certain feeling that we may not feel safe to express. There may be a certain sentence, a certain phrase, a certain thing that we want to say that we don't feel safe and we don't express it. Once the feminine feels safe because the safety is offered by the masculine and the expression happens, energy transforms, emotion transforms. So yeah, we can say we're doing shadow work, but because the shadow is an emotive process, and because the feminine is the emotive process, they're very, very much connected when we're talking about our traumas and our inner wounding. And when that becomes expressed, we elevate those emotions transform, we reach conscious feminine energy because that conscious masculine container is provided. So before I mentioned the unhealthy ego and about giving 0 Fs about everyone and everything, when it wants what it wants, when it needs what it needs. But when we learn to practice shadow work and we eventually practice self-love and offering love to those around us, we are actually able to show up in service and in going beyond ourselves and not just self-serving our unhealthy ego or shadow. The shadow can actually hijack the unhealthy ego. Because remember when I said that our subconscious mind is responsible for about 90% of our decision making? We can actually relate that to the shadow in this sense. In the Jungian school of thought, we can say that the shadow is responsible for about 90% of our decision making because it's the denied. It's what's coming through as reactions and triggers to get our attention. That's why shit happens. Because something within us is asking for our attention. So the shadow actually hijacks the ego. And in this sense, because the shadow is very much about something that doesn't feel safe within us, something we've denied, that will bleed into our egoic experience, because the ego is about the physical condition. So we can get hyper obsessed with security, hyper obsessed with money, hyper obsessed with anything that will give us a sense of safety, a sense of having enough. We can see this with money. We can see this with sex. We can see this with food, right? All these material, physical experiences as part of our humanity, which we need to develop healthy relationships with. It's not about negating money, negating sex, negating food. It's about developing and cultivating healthy relationships with money, sex, intimacy, food, even the occasional treat. Because we are human beings and we do need to feel safe. We need a sense of security. And that actually all starts with the feminine. The feminine polarity within each and every one of us. The shadow feminine that can push the shadow masculine to the outer experience and to embody that unhealthy ego that is all about themselves and is really just self-serving. But when we learn to heal our inner world, our inner experience, That will heal our outer world, our outer experience. We're going to want to connect more. We're going to want to be with people that can raise us and we can raise them. That's innate in us. That's like natural for us. That's a natural part of our humanity. It's actually how we're wired. We're social animals. We're social beings. So you see how no matter what we call the thing, we always need to practice non-judgment and inner safety. And when our traumas come to the surface, when the unexpressed becomes expressed, then ultimately the feminine and the masculine start to reunite within ourselves. This is a key process because the bridging of the masculine and the feminine signifies that they were separated. And that is actually exactly what the root of the shadow is, right? When we start to deny, when we start to reject, when we start to repress, we're basically separate. Separation from a certain life experience, life expression, no matter how hard and difficult it may be, is still a part of us. And when we start to say that it's not worthy, it's not good enough, that it doesn't deserve my love, that is when we start to separate ourselves from that process that actually needs us more than ever. So shadow, when we say the shadow, it's basically separation. It's separation. That's why the shadow is very much involved and a part of the masculine and feminine work, because the masculine and feminine have been separated due to the existence and appearance of the shadow. So I hope that clears it up a little bit more for you, because I didn't want you thinking after episode 2 and 3 that the shadow is only the feminine. The shadow has its emotive processes. The feminine has her emotive processes. The shadow feminine has her emotive processes. That feeds the shadow masculine, which is how we show up into our external environment. Again, this is polarities. It's not about males and females. So I hope that serves you. I'm going to leave it for today. I think that's enough food for thought. I will come back next week for another episode. If you are watching on YouTube, please hit that like, subscribe, and share the content if you so feel called. I so greatly appreciate that. If you're tuning in from one of the platforms online, thank you for joining in as well. So I will be back next week. And as always, please remember that you are the medicine and I am just the messenger. Take care.